I didn't think I'd ever write poetry. And when I began writing, it was creative nonfiction and narrative, maybe those kind of things. And when I got involved with the poetry, it came as a surprise. But in some ways, it still is storytelling, as I found out. So I've enjoyed that.
Welcome to Growing Inspiration, the podcast that celebrates beauty, wisdom, and creativity through the timeless traditions of the liberal arts. I'm your host, Shana McLean, and I invite you to take a few minutes for yourself to allow ideas to cross-pollinate and unexpected connections to bloom. In each episode, you can expect thought-provoking conversations with scholars, writers, and creative minds who understand that the most fertile thinking happens at the intersections. We'll explore how the arts, humanities, and the sciences continue to shape innovative thinking today. So get ready to cultivate your intellectual curiosity and join a community of interdisciplinary thinkers as we discover new perspectives and spark our creativity. I have a wonderful conversation to share with you today. Poet and photographer Greg Clary joins me to talk about growing up in rural West Virginia and the way he came to his art later in life. We talk about his new book, The Vandalia in Me, which combines poetry and photos that evoke places and people he has known. When he shares a new poem, you'll be hard-pressed not to shed a tear. Join me now in conversation with Greg Clary. Hello, Greg. Welcome to Growing Inspiration. It's nice to have you here today.
I appreciate being invited.
So I've been looking forward to our conversation, partly because I grew up just north of where you grew up, and we were introduced by my brother, who is also a poet. So can you give us a little bit about your background and where you come from?
Okay. Well, I live in northwestern PA, near where you grew up, but I was born and raised in West Virginia, southern West Virginia, near Huntington. And I grew up in a very rural area. No name of the community, we call it Green Bottom. But I grew up in a holler called Turkey Creek. My mother passed away when I was young, and I was raised by my grandmother until I was 8. And at the age of 8, I moved up to the family homestead up on Turkey Creek, and that's where I grew up. And I just had this wonderful life there. It was, we grew burley tobacco. My great aunt and great uncle was who I lived with, and they worked outside the home, and around me were friends and family, and I was an only child, so it was a really great experience. The house I grew up in had no running water, and didn't have any running water or a bathroom until I was gone and went to college. So we dipped our bucket into a nearby spring that my great grandfather had dug when he built the place, and really didn't think much of it. We heated the house with an old Buckeye potbelly coal burning stove. That was great as long as you're in the same room with it. But the back bedrooms where I slept were unheated, and so that's where we slept. And it wasn't until I was probably 7 or 8 when we had electric blankets, and it changed my life. I mean, you go in that back bedroom, and then you get an electric blanket. It's like, oh, this is so nice. But I say all this just to describe that how I grew up is really atypical, but it really wasn't bad. It was it's just how it was.
Right.
And then I moved to northwestern Pennsylvania, really in 1978. And like a lot of people from West Virginia, I thought, well, I'm going to leave home for 2 or 3 years. I'm going to come back and live my life. And I never went back. And that's fine because I have had a great life here. But I do have our homestead back in Turkey Creek, 160 acres. I built a cabin there about 30 years ago. So I go home, I see what's left of my family, I see friends, and I hunt and I fish and I do things that keep me connected. So although I left West Virginia, I really never left in a lot of ways.
Right. Right. And so you just recently came out with a new book. I think this was about the start of the year that your new book came out.
Correct.
And so that's the Vandalia in Me.
Right.
And can you tell us a little bit about what Vandalia means to you and kind of where the title came from?
Sure. Vandalia was a word that was coined by Benjamin Franklin to describe the, quote, wild country west of the Allegheny Mountains during the colonial days. It's a derivative of the word vandal, I suppose, describing the Vandals that invaded Rome. And at one point, when West Virginia broke away from Virginia during the Civil War, the state almost became Vandalia. There was a move afoot to name it Vandalia. But instead it got this exciting name called West Virginia, and that's sort of what stuck. The highest folklife award given in West Virginia for music and art is the Vandalia Award. So if you're from West Virginia, that name rings a bell. People know I know what that is. And so the Vandalia in me is another way of saying the West Virginia in me in many ways.
Right. And there's one of your poems kind of at the beginning of the book that is connected to the title, Vandalia in Me. There's a stanza that says, bring out the Celtic cross in me, the wariness of exploitation, the deep-rooted cynicism, the despair of outlander colonization, the despisal of Ulster plantation repression, the contempt for disrespect. And that really resonated with me. It reminded me of so much about all the people I grew up with. I wonder, is that kind of the feeling of the cultural kind of feeling in West Virginia where you grew up?
Well, growing up in West Virginia, I didn't really realize living there how we are the butt of so many jokes by people who aren't from that area. Listen, I've heard West Virginia jokes when I moved to Pennsylvania. It depends on how they're told. I can laugh or I can take offense. I'll tell you a story. I've never told this story before. The first day I was teaching a class at the college level, I was introducing myself to the class, and I said, I'm from West Virginia. And this young student, a woman, immediately laughed. It was like it was just an involuntary reaction was this laugh. And I always remembered that. And she was a great kid. It wasn't like she was being offensive. But I want to say, what was, and that was sort of the response. And so for people from West Virginia, I guess we can have kind of thin skin in terms of being the butt of so many stereotypes and so many kind of things that are offensive that aren't really true. There's always an element of truth in every stereotype, but when you generalize the whole state and whole population, that becomes something else. Mm-hmm. And so that poem is also related to many come from Scotch-Irish backgrounds. And so the Ulster plantation, the despisal, that's sort of, we carry that over with us into Appalachia when that migration happened. It's twofold, I guess.
Right. Yeah. That not wanting to submit to authority, not wanting to be told what to do, wanting to get as far away from that as possible out into the woods. So you mentioned, being a college professor. How did that long, career, how does that contribute to your poetry and your photography? We haven't even gotten to your photography yet.
I graduated from Marshall University with a degree in counseling and then also rehabilitation sciences, working with people with disabilities. And then I ended up getting a PhD in special ed. And I worked as an addiction therapist in a mental health setting in West Virginia, but I always knew that I wanted to get into higher education if I could. I had such great experiences as a student, and what better place to work than around other young people. So I ended up getting a job at Penn State at University Park as assistant director of the Upward Bound program. And I don't know if you're familiar with Upward Bound. It's a nationally funded program through the Department of Ed, which, as you know, yesterday, it could be a death knell for the Department of Ed, the federal Department of Ed. And that program worked with students like me, how I grew up, students who were first-generation college students, to encourage them to go on to post-secondary education of some kind. Not necessarily college, but workforce preparation or two-year school, anything, and to give them the opportunity to aspire to something beyond what they typically wouldn't have experienced. And so I was there at Penn State for 3 years doing that. And then I came to Clarion University in 1981 as director of a program similar, but only working with students who are already in college, called Student Support Services. And these are students who are first generation college, who may come from low income backgrounds, disadvantaged backgrounds, and students with disabilities. So I did a lot of work in that early part of developing programs for students with disabilities before the ADA even came along. This is under the 504 Act and the Rehab Act. So did a lot of writing, did a lot of grant writing, did a lot of, I became a department chair, did a lot of, that kind of administrative writing. I got involved with, as chair of faculty senate at Clarion. So all this writing had nothing to do with being creative. It was like a recipe, you follow it, this is what you did. And then when I retired, I was getting to retire in 2017, I was taking photographs in a pretty serious way. I wanted to anyway. And my wife, to my surprise, enrolled me into a creative nonfiction workshop with down in Pittsburgh, a 6-week workshop.
And those two things really got me on the road to writing and taking photographs.
Do you feel like anything from your background like finds its way into your poetry, or does it come from a place that's a little further back in West Virginia?
When I wrote the book, I was surprised, and I went home. I went to a couple readings back home around people who knew me growing up, and for me, that was a real test. Are they going to be okay with this? Because sometimes you write things like he's full of it or whatever, But people say I enjoy those stories, and I never saw it as storytelling, but it is narrative poetry. And so, how I'm talking stories about my experiences and where I lived and people I met, these are stories in the form of prose poetry. So, in that regard, yes. The photographs are images of things that are ordinary that I find interesting. Photographers and poets both frame a reference on their perspective in a moment in their own way. So they share that commonality. You and I can see the same thing, but I frame it in my perspective, you frame it in yours, and both the poetry and the photographs reflect what I'm seeing at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the photographs in the book are very evocative in your perspective or the way you've cropped them. It provides a kind of that, 1 inch window of like what you're seeing and how you're seeing it for someone else. One of the poems that I enjoyed a lot was one that you wrote about your Uncle Wilmer, I believe. It's so evocative that it reminded me a lot of my grandfather, and just that kind of rough, tough. I've had a hard life. I'm working as hard as I can, and it's interesting that you. How do you choose words? Do you really think about it a lot, or do you just kind of write and let it all out?
I write. I probably should do more editing than I do, but I write and I read it out loud. And if I can read it out loud and it makes sense. I'm also fortunate that my wife has an English background. She has a degree in English, and she taught English in high school before she did other things. And she has a degree in English literature. So she's my best editor. And if it doesn't ring with her, then I pretty much will either put it down or no, I got to go back to it. But she's been a real support for me, both in the poetry and the photographs. And what I mean by that is that she enrolled me in that creative workshop when I retired. She bought me my first real, big boy camera when I was just sort of snapping things. And you can tell from the book, there's a lot of photographs that are sort of ordinary, and we'll be driving along and I look at something or she'll look at something. She says, "You want to turn around?" And so I'll turn around. And the key to a lot of those is you take the time to turn around.
Yeah.
She's never complained. She's always been supportive. So I really owe a lot to her for that.
I think I saw something that you said in another interview about like finding the beauty in the ordinary.
Yes.
What could you say about that as far as like what's around us and taking the time to?
I don't take a lot of portraits, but when I do, I always get people's permission to take their picture. Sometimes people are in positions where they don't want to be photographed because it's not the best look. You know what I mean? It's interesting, but I don't want to put them in a situation where they're embarrassed or to feel like they're being exploited. I think if I can do that, if I can show reality, if I can show us something and not exploit it, either not just people, but also of a scene, then I think that's important. Again, I go back to West Virginia. So think about when you think about West Virginia, you don't tell me what you're thinking, but when we talk about the war on poverty in the 1960s and all that, they had all these, national press came into Appalachia and they took all these photographs of these poor kids and impoverished homes. And then they took the photographs and then out they went. And what we're left with are these images without any stories behind this. And I think even now, when the flooding that goes on, if you think about a coal mine disaster or a bridge collapses, the national press they'll parachute in, get their story, and then they'll leave. And a lot of people feel like they've been exploited. That goes back to kind of being kind of thin-skinned. So my point is, when I take photographs or when I write about people, I try not to exploit them. I try to be fair to them and still be real to what's going on.
That's a very good perspective as far as I think for any writer or artist being sensitive to the subject and what they have to carry on with them beyond that photograph or the poem.
When I taught a course on disability studies, and I used to teach
how people with disabilities are depicted in photographs.
Hmm.
And there's different genres. One of them is disability as spectacle. So you have somebody who is a spectacle in some ways, really interesting in their photograph as an object or objectified. And I've used that as an example of how people from Appalachia are often photographed, objectified. They go by this house and, you got these little barefooted kids running around and people are thinking, oh my God, I'm glad it's not me, but they're still fascinated by it, So trying to get away from that kind of imagery, stereotyping.
Right. Now on your Instagram page, I noticed you had a lot of photos of owls and raptors. Where did you get those photographs? Where do you go to do that?
Well, right here, I'm lucky to live right here in Clarion. I'm about an hour away from the elk herd up in St. Mary's, up in Elk County, and they call it bugling season when the rut is on in early September. People come in and take photographs. We go year round. The eagles, that's really what got me into nature photography. I bought my first long lens. There was an eagle's nest, a bald eagle's nest that appeared about 5 miles from my house, right on the Clarion River. And it was like this starter's nest. This young eagle couple had their first nest, and that was in 2017, and it's still there. They just raised another hatch. And I got so excited because I'd never seen a bald eagle before. And I got this long lens. I started taking photographs. And it was so close by that I would go there. I mean, I felt like I had to sneak out of the house from my wife. Like, where are you going? I'm just going to get some milk. I'll be right back. And I go by the eagle's nest. I got hooked on taking the bald eagles, the elk. And then some friends of mine were taking photographs of short-eared owls, which are really fascinating. They're in our area. They don't breed here typically, but they come down from Canada north in the winter to eat. And they're just amazing. They come out in the evening at dark. They are owls. So getting those photographs before it's too dark to take is a challenge. But they're just, I got so much into them. So a lot of the owls, the raptors, the elk are all from within an hour of where I am.
That's fascinating.
Lucky to live here.
Right. And you said you're on the Clarion River?
Yes, right. I live in a little town called Sligo, but we have a place on the Clarion River about 20 minutes away. So spend a lot of time.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
But we've talked a lot about kind of your background and so forth, but do you have favorites, a favorite poem that you would like to share or something new that you'd like to read for us?
I do have one I had picked out. This is a new poem. This is not in the book, but I was at a writing workshop a month ago, and I wrote this and read it in public for the first time, and people really liked it. And I think it has been accepted to a journal, in fact, a journal that Brady's involved with.
Yes.
So
yes, I think he gave me a little hint. He's like, yeah, don't tell him that it was accepted. But
well, I learned that it was. So anyway, this is a poem that after the book came out, I feel like I was in postpartum depression. I feel like I'll never write another poem of my life, But lately it's been coming back. So this is one I want to read called While Attending an Amish Horse Auction. And let me just say before I read it, there's a significant Amish community around where I live, and I've interacted with them quite a bit. And they have auctions for a variety of things. But the annual horse auction is an amazing affair because other Amish communities come in for it. They have a horse broker that comes in from Ohio with all these horses, and he'll describe these horses to them, like you would describe your kids, their personality, their temperament, all these things. Then they go up for auction. And I started going there because I was amazed by how he did. I was writing things down. Not that I care about horses, but how he described them really was interesting. I started going through this. That's why I was there, not to buy a horse, but to view it. It was the kind of raw Saturday that called for coffee in a thermos and boots that could tolerate manure. My Amish neighbors, bearded, black-hatted, plain of speech but generous of conversation, were holding their annual horse auction. All of the men wore suspenders with names like Eli, Jacob, or Aaron. Everyone but me. A big event by Clarion County standards. There were fry pies, roasted chicken, and molasses cookies that tasted like my mamaw's warm kitchen. These horses were not meant for plowing. No fur-dragging workhorses with flanks like tree trunks. These are the buggy pullers, the trot-along a country road types. Most of them saddlebreds with a few sleek thoroughbreds added, like feathers in a box of nails. Teenage boys, too young for beards, but already walking with purpose, led the horses into the auction ring. Each gate an essential detail, each toss of the head an indication of temperament. The auctioneer had the rhythm of a man who could sell you wind on a still day. She's traffic safe, not lazy, smart head on her, works a spreader if needed, will go 10 to 12 miles. Sold for $5,000. Your old gelding, never abused, good legs, easy keeper. Your neighbor will think he's 5. Sold for $2,500. 13-year-old gelding, good grandpa horse, safe with children, calm, steady with big box trucks. $1,300. And then, because the story often holds a tragedy, the cart-pulling ponies came into view. A match set like bookends or those elderly couples you sometimes see at the grocery store, holding a single shopping basket between them. I'd seen the pair earlier in the holding pen, nuzzling each other, swapping breath, one leaning ever so slightly into the other's shoulder like a sigh. The auctioneer announced they'd be sold separately, just like that. The first pony went for $1,700 to a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since he was a baby. He took the bridle, turned, and walked off without so much as a glance at the other half of the pair. That's when the screaming started. Sharp, high-pitched, frantic, not human sounds, but recognizable all the same. The sold pony trying to turn as far as the harness would allow, the other wheeling in a panic, calling to what had just become the memory of a companion. Everyone, Amish and English alike, stood still, folding our hands the way you do when you don't quite know what to do with them. For a moment, I felt the weight of it all. I considered the quiet truth, how money, cold and on feeling, can slip the lock on doors mercy can't open. The auctioneer, who had seen all this before, cleared his throat as if nothing had happened. Here's a nice steady little mare, safe with your woman and kids, good hind end. He'll start at $500. And the gavel, like a heartbreaking, came down.
Mm.
And people, the response I've gotten is that this relates to what's going on right now with people being rounded up and separated. People told me it reminded them of the slave block involving humans 200 or 100 years ago. So I think it resonates that way.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And, that's one thing I remember growing up. We had the Amish kids in our school for a while, so they had their own schoolhouse built. And, they were all around our area. And, very, very kind and generous people, but they were very practical as well, and it's an interesting culture and an interesting insight into, but like you said, the poem evokes so much more than just that particular event. Thank you for sharing that. And
Thanks.
that'll be is that the Watershed Journal that it's going to be in? Or
It's going to be the Bridge Literary Journal.
Okay.
And Oil City, Franklin.
Right.
And Brady's heavily involved in that group too.
Right. And that's, I think the Bridge Fest is coming up in September. He's hoping to have that out for that. Yeah. Great. I guess, you mentioned that you had just gone to the auction and started writing down some of the things because the ways he described the horses caught your ear. How do, poems or photographs kind of come to you? Is it serendipity for the most part?
It is. I keep a pad and pencil in my truck, and if I hear something on the radio, like a phrase or a word, I'll write it down. If I'm talking with my friends, especially when I go home, because I have so many friends who tell such colorful stories. In the book, in Vandalia, a lot of those involve my friends. Straight stories that they told me. I don't know if you remember the one about the online dating, about the guy who was invited to the party. Told him you bring refreshments. Did you read that poem?
I believe so, but I don't remember exactly what happened.
So it was about a friend whose wife had died, and after some time he wanted to date again. So he got online and got involved in a dating thing. So they said, well, come out to this thing. We're going to have a pool party. You bring refreshments. And my friend says, what happened? He said, well, I got out there and everybody was naked. He says, what'd you do? He says, I got my Pepsi and went home. I thought that was a great story. So those kind of things sometimes come up,
Right. Right. That's great. Is there anything that you could describe that maybe were like the similarities or differences in the way that you approach poetry versus photography? You mentioned, that it's your way of framing what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Is there something like a difference in the way you would approach them, or are they pretty much just outgrowths verbally versus, visually?
They're both, what I observe. I mean, the poems come from what I hear and what I observe. The photographies, if I see an image. But I will say this: I'm involved with the Watershed Literary Group in Brookville, and they were very big in getting me on board. The second issue they had, I was a featured photographer, and they published my first poem, and that's a great group. That's how I met Brady as well and some other people, and they've been very supportive. It involves a group of people who have published quite a bit, to people who haven't published anything but simply like to write. And that group has a bookstore, they do the journal, they do workshops. And my experience has been they're so supportive of each other, so encouraging. I take photographs and I meet people, but I find the photography, just maybe the people I'm encountering, it's more competitive.
Mm.
You go to a shot and there's maybe 5 photographers around. We're all seeing the same thing. And there's not a lot of, my experience, not a lot of cooperation, not a lot of, it's more, I gotta, you know, but I find that my writing community is much more supportive than the people I meet in the field for taking photographs.
That's interesting. Yeah. I interviewed my cousin Katrina, who's an amateur photographer, and she had found a few online communities that she was comfortable with, but I think she expressed similar feelings about, the competitiveness or wanting to get the exact shot or that sort of thing. Something that I asked her about, I'd be interested in your perspective as well, is the advent of AI and how that's affecting everything, particularly photography, images.
You know what? I do very little post production in my photographs. I don't even have any. I have a free software called GIMP that I've had on my computer for years. It's the only post production I use versus the more advanced kind of things. There's been photo contests where a person will take this photograph and then go in and remove a person out of the background, doctor it up all the way, and they get caught doing that. But I can't even begin to imagine what AI is going to do with everything, with writing, with photography, with filmmaking. I saw a film yesterday, some advanced AI thing that was incredible. Song and dance and music on a current event that just happened like the day before. It was that quick. When I taught, and this was before, this is when Google was coming around. You see cut and paste, people, sometimes students would sort of doctor a paper. And I had things I would do to sort of get ahead of it. But now I can imagine teaching and giving a written assignment and knowing what's out there. I don't know how they do it.
Right. It's almost like you have to expect it to be written by AI.
I haven't read it. I have seen some professors talk about, well, we can use AI to our advantage. I'm sure you can, but I don't know how that would be. I guess there's ways to do it, but I'm glad I'm out.
Are there any upcoming projects or events that you're looking forward to?
I do have. Later this month. I'm going down home to a reading at a bookstore called Cicada Books in Huntington, West Virginia. I did one at Book Tenders back in January that had about 30 people come out for the reading. People I grew up with, people who were friends and family. I'll be 72 years old. I had a former teacher of mine came to the reading. Wasn't that great?
Huh.
And she golfed. She does a newspaper column. I had her in the 7th grade, and I stayed in touch with her. So to have her there was just a real pleasure. So I'm going back home in 2 weeks. I'm going to go to Cicada, and I expect to see some people. And then the next night, some friends of mine do a big bluegrass festival, and I'm going to have a booth and have about the book there as well. So I'm looking forward to going home and doing that.
Great. Do you see another book in your future?
I get asked that question. I probably have about a dozen poems now that bubbled up. So we'll see what happens. I didn't think I'd ever write poetry. And when I began writing, it was creative nonfiction and narrative, maybe those kind of things. And that was the workshop I went to was about that. And when I got involved with the poetry, it came as a surprise. But in some ways, it still is storytelling, as I found out. So I've enjoyed that. Bill Turman, who wrote one of the intros in the book, Bill was, I know, involved with the Bridge. I went to a poetry reading in Clarion with he and some of his students several years ago. And he's such a great poet, and he reads so well. And I was amazed. I thought, this is so good. I didn't know it could be so good. I'm thinking unicorns and flowers and, but it wasn't that way. And it just showed me another way. And Phil's been a real support too as I've done all this.
Great. Well, I really have enjoyed having the chance to talk to you, and thank you for sharing your poetry with us and your photography.
It was an honor to be here with you, and I really appreciate you inviting me, and hope to meet you in person someday. And
yes, maybe even at the Bridge Fest.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love that. Good.
All right.
Well,
Well,
good
have
luck
a
to you.
wonderful day. It was great to see you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Growing Inspiration. Please take a moment to subscribe and share with someone who needs to hear this today. To learn more and subscribe to my newsletter for exclusive content and notice of upcoming events, visit my website at gardenofmydelights.com. You can also connect with me on Instagram for more inspiration. Follow me at Garden of My Delights. Until next time, keep nurturing your creativity and looking for beauty and wisdom all around you.